Hello and welcome to Working Through Salvator Fabris The Art of the Italian Rapier, a book by Tom Leoni, chapters 1 through 6. My name is Esteban de la Boca. I'm a member of the SCA in the Kingdom of Glen Albin, and I am hoping to instruct myself and you through the art of dueling, which is Salvator Fabris's Rapier Fencing Treatise of 1606. My goals when working through Fabris's text are to gain a further understanding of Fabris's technique and methodology, to develop a series of drills to instruct new fencers based on Fabris's designs, to gain insight into what Fabris's teaching methodology would have been, because often manuals are fairly complex and mention key information in areas that are not the area they're currently talking about, and to recreate Fabris's techniques in a way that would be more usable within the SCA's heavy rapier rule set, because Fabris is instructing one on how to kill their opponent, and we are working within a touch-to-kill system, so the sword does not have to go as far, so the body positions aren't exactly the same. So what book are we working through? Salvator Fabris's Ciencia de Arma by Tom Leoni. This book is absolutely fantastic. It is a complete translation of the book from Salvator Fabris. It has a fantastic glossary at the end, and Tom Leoni himself has put many resources available online for anyone moving through this text. This book is available on Lulu using the link below. Salvator Fabris says at the beginning of his book, "Please have faith in me because in my time I have accumulated a vast amount of experience both in first person and in assimilating the knowledge of others. I would ask that you have faith in me as well. I have been fencing within the Fabris system for the last 6 years. My instructor, Maestro Ryan DeLoss of Glen Albin, has been fencing within the Fabris system for most of his time fencing within the SCA. So I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on the subject material. That being said, I am doing this entire course to learn. So if there's something I get incorrect throughout the course, please let me know in the comments, shoot me an email. I would love to go back and fix it." Fabris splits his manual into 2 books, and each book is split into a series of chapters. I'm going to be covering these chapters one at a time throughout this series in order. So before I begin, each chapter is going to be introduced. I'll let you know exactly what we're covering. That should be the title of each video. And it should be split into chapters. If you want to just look at one chapter, it should be pretty easy to do so. After I introduce the chapter, I'm going to summarize the material covered in each section, focusing on the main ideas. Fabris and a lot of the other fencing masters have a habit of talking about other things in the middle of their chapter. For example, on a chapter on why you shouldn't fling the sword, Fabris will talk about beat attacks and a few other things. I'm going to be focusing on the main ideas and then using Fabris's main ideas to support, or as evidence to support other parts of the book. I'm then going to demonstrate the primary techniques that Fabris describes in each chapter and develop a drill so that you can at home practice solo or with a partner through these drills to kind of gain an understanding of the methodology laid forward in the book. So let's begin with the first chapter, General Preface to Book 1, on the basics of the sword alone. So this is where Fabris lays out his methodology and how he's structuring his book. Everything he mentions is going to get covered in time, but he gives kind of a vocabulary dump immediately. Whenever you're stuck on vocabulary with this book, Tom Leoni has a wonderful glossary at the end of it, and he also has many footnotes to kind of help you translate it. The key terms that Fabris lays out are all listed here, but I'm only going to talk about a few because they're going to be used again in the upcoming chapters. Tempi is the plural of tempo, and it's a single movement that you perform in fencing. This could be a step forward, this could be an extension of your arm, a disengagement of the blade, but it's any single action. A contratempi is the plural of contratempo, and that's when you perform a movement in the middle of your opponent's movement that interrupts your opponent's movement. Fabris is a huge fan of waiting for the opponent, and as they try to do something, attacking, and he does this by putting his body in a position that is very able to counterattack. And so he talks about this here. He talks about the cavazione, which is the disengage, to move your sword from one side of an opponent's sword to the other. And then the contracavazione, when your opponent disengages around your sword, you quickly disengage around their sword, and you end up in the same position. When Fabris talks about his book, he talks about how it's split into two parts. And the first book is going to focus only on single sword techniques. So if you're looking for sword and dagger, sword and cloak, that's going to be in a long while from now, because he first focuses on the single sword, because he feels like if you have mastery over just the sword, adding a secondary in is just kind of, there as a bonus. Everything he talks about is focused into 4 guards, first, second, third, and fourth. He talks about how you should always assume that he is in one of these 4 guards and not a bastard guard, meaning no position in between. I like to think of it as your quillions on your guard are either completely vertical or completely horizontal. There's no sort of like 45-degree angle or anything going on. And this is because when your opponent has to go around your guard, it takes them longer to go completely around the quillions if they're completely walling off a section and not kind of contributing to the circle. Fabris also touches on the 2 distances, postures and counter postures, which I'm going to be covering in a few moments. Chapter 2 of Fabris's book is the 4 basic guards and the reason for their name. So here I'm demonstrating how you should hold your sword in Fabris's system. You can see that the pommel is completely aligned with my wrist, that I have my 4 fingers on the handle of the sword, and my index finger is above the ricasso. You can see that I am able to completely balance my sword and move it up and down without having to grip it with my thumb, which is very important because you don't want to have your sword grip too tightly. You need to be able to rotate it in between these 4 guards, kind of by not just moving your wrist, but rolling your fingers to make these movements as tiny as possible. If you're doing it with your fingers, it's a very small movement, but if you're moving your whole arm or your whole hand, it's a larger movement and therefore going to take longer. And Fabris was a huge fan of tiny, fast movements. Here we see the first guard. The guard is called this because as you would pull your sword from its scabbard, as you reach in, you'll notice that your pinky finger, if you put your hand by your hip, is towards the ground, and as you make that natural drawing motion, it ends up with your pinky towards the ceiling and your thumb towards the ground, and this would be the first position that your sword would end up in after it is drawn. From there, if we just rotate naturally from our hand to go into a more natural position, we end up in the second hand guard. In this guard, the quillions are completely flat, and this is the guard you would use if you wanted to push a sword away from you towards what's known as your outside, or if you look at your fencing arm, right, the part that is going away from your body. If you're right-handed, that would be towards your right-hand side, and left-handed towards your left-hand side. Once you're in the second guard and you continue to rotate your hand around, you end up in the third guard. The third guard is what most people would consider a standard guard. It's known for being an intermediary guard. This guard is good for swapping between second and fourth very quickly, but you never really want to try to rotate through 2 guards, so you wouldn't move from third into first, because that would be a fairly difficult thing to do. And then if we continue to rotate the guard, we end up in what Fabris refers to as the fourth hand guard. Again, the quillion should be completely flat, and this fourth hand guard is the guard we would use to push people away from us from our inside line. This would be like your chest area, okay? So the fourth hand guard is used primarily to protect your entire body, and when you completely roll into it, the sword generally ends up while you're parrying aligned with your inner hip, or the hip that's opposite your sword hip, right? And this is going to be a very defensive guard. Chapter 3 of Fabris's manual, Book 1, is Division of the Sword, in order to know its debole and forte. Debole means weak, or closer to the tip of the blade, and forte means strong, closer to the hilt of the blade where your hand is. The closer you are to the hilt of the blade, the more you're going to use it for defense, and the closer you are to the tip of the blade, the more you use it for offense. Fabris describes the sword as divided into 4 parts. Other fencing masters describe the sword in many other sections, but I like Fabris's because it makes it pretty easy to teach. The first part of the sword is going to be by your hand, and then as you move to the middle of your blade, that's going to be the second part. When you move from the middle towards the tip, that's going to be the third part, and then finally from there you're going to move towards the tip and end up in the fourth part. The first part, again, for defense, the fourth part, again, for offense. This is going to be important when we talk about gaining the blade, finding the sword, postures, and counter postures, which I will go more into in a second. Here we see 2 fencers. We have one on guard to the left and one on the right trying to do what's known as finding or gaining the blade. This is where you try to make sure a stronger section of your sword is over a weaker section of theirs. We know that the tip is section 4, and that is going to extend roughly a fourth of the way down the blade. So we would want section 3 of our sword over that sword, like so, 3 or beyond. Now I would argue here this is a little bit too much of a gain, because the goal is to find a position where you can easily push the blade around, but not make it super easy for them to disengage around the blades themselves. As I continue to move up the sword, it's kind of a sliding motion to make sure my 3 connects to their 4, my 2 connects to their 3, and then finally my 1 connects to their 2, and by then I should have hit them entirely. So you can see here, he's in a position where he has to completely disengage around my quillions. Again, this is why there's a real importance in keeping those hand positions completely flat in second and fourth to maximize how much that disengage has to happen. So again, on the other side in second, I'm going to slide gradually down my opponent's blade, and that is known as gaining the blade, when your stronger section is over their weaker section, because from here he's really not going to be able to do anything to the position of my sword using his own sword. It's a simple leverage problem. So now that we understand the strong and the weak of the blade, and we understand the 4 hand positions, we can start to move into how to form the counter postures, which would be chapter 4 of book 1, in order to learn how the sword and body should be positioned and when the counter postures should be formed. Now, Fabris said that forming a good counter posture means situating the body and the sword in such a way that without touching your opponent's blade, the straight line between the opponent's point and your body is completely defended, which gives you ample time to parry. What this means is that you want to be behind a wall sort of created by your sword, so that if your opponent extends their sword straight forward, they'll run into your sword, it will block their sword from hitting you, and it'll move right past you. Fabris also here gives some important insight into his methodology. He is very against touching the opponent's blade. The Spanish felt that touching an opponent's blade gave you a lot of information that you could use. Fabris felt like this is true, but also it was a bad thing because they could use it against you, and it was better just to have the superior position. So the first thing you need to do is situate your sword so that it's stronger than your opponent's. The advice I've gotten on this before from Puck Curtis was that you need to point at the thing that scares you. So you would, if your opponent, or if your sword is to the outside of your opponent, you're going to be pointing towards their guard, and the same if on the inside. The tip of your blade should slightly point towards that guard. So your tip should never leave the profile of your opponent's body. Otherwise, it's going to be too far offline for you to kind of bring it back towards them. You should also make sure that your strong is over their weak. Again, that's like in the previous section. If you are covering the tip of their sword, you should be a little bit further along on your blade to where section 3 of your blade is over section 4 of theirs. And your body should be on one side of the sword. If I hold my sword in the dead center of my chest, even if I create a wonderful posture, it's still possible for my opponent's tip to hit me straight in the chest. So I should make sure that my guard is aligned with either one hip or the other. I would recommend your sword hip for second and your opposite hip for fourth hand position. And this way you're always pushing your opponent to the correct side. So here I have a drill for how to drill counter posture formation. First, your opponent's going to take any guard pointing the sword at you, and you're going to sort of extend your blade and point over your opponent's guard. After you point over their guard, you're going to roll into the appropriate hand position. Fourth hand position, if the opponent's blade is to your inside, pointed more at your chest, or second hand position, if your opponent's blade is pointed more towards your outside, or your sword hand, hip, and body section there. Then, if you think you have a correct counter posture, you're going to have your opponent walk straight towards you, and their tip should move just past your body. Okay, we're not looking for this crazy, drastic body position where their tip is going way off beyond you. You want it to move just past you because, again, the smaller the movement, the faster that you can perform it. It would also be a good idea to practice putting your offhand into a correct position to intercept the blade as well, which gives you additional safety and helps you prepare for when we introduce secondaries. And the second hand position, it's very much the same thing. Point at the thing that scares you. Make sure you have an appropriate gain on the sword. Here you can see that my section 3 at the very beginning is intersecting the section 2. He walks forward, and notice his blade slides right into my guard as he walks forward, making it pretty obvious that at that point he would continue onto my blade. Whenever you practice a new position or posture as we work through this Fabris manual, this is always a good practice. It's a great way to tell if you're forming a guard or position correctly, or if you're maybe a little bit off before you get into more complicated movements like stepping forward and lunging. Okay, Chapter 5 is explanation of the two measures, the Larga and the strata, on a way to gain one and the other with little danger. The misura larga is what we would call lunging distance. This is the position where if you fully extend your sword and then take a large step forward, you should be able to hit your opponent. The misura strata is where you can just extend your sword and lean your body forward to hit your opponent. So the large measure and the small measure. It's also important to mention out of measure, which is where you are, where your opponent cannot perform any single action to hit you. Okay. For example, you're not worried about your opponent, just lunging and hitting you, but they may be able to step forward and feint and then hit you, right? So Fabris describes here how to get into the misura larga and the misura strata, and he talks about how unsafe it is, right? This is always going to be the riskiest part of fencing. Once you're in these positions, generally things go pretty smoothly, but getting into them is where bad things happen. The first thing you need to do to get into misura larga is to form your counter posture while you are out of measure. But Fabris talks in great detail about how you shouldn't just maintain a solid posture. A lot of times in STA fencing especially, you see people adopt just one posture and they stay in it, and then they maybe go back and forth, and then they walk towards their opponent in that posture. And this gives your opponent time to plan and react and do something that's going to make you uncomfortable. So you're going to form your counter posture right before you try to get into the misura larga. You're not going to form it and then prance around and banter with your opponent. You form it and go. Okay. You're going to take a step forward after you formed your counter posture into your lunging distance. Okay. If your opponent is taking steps backwards or doing other things, this may take more than one tempo, but for each extra tempo it takes, it becomes more unsafe because you're giving your opponent time to react while you're moving. So really you want to do this in one motion. Okay? Fabris actually recommends that you do something to distract your opponent while you do this. You do a feint to bring them out of their guard and force them to have to go back into it, or you do some sort of circular motion to gain distance. But whatever you do, you want to get into the misura larga. Once you're there, if they don't do anything, or if they don't move their blade, maybe they move sideways, or maybe they adjust their guard, but they don't really change the position of power that you have in your counter posture, lunge and hit them, okay? It's just a simple step forward, and if you have the position of power with your blade, if you found their blade, like I've shown earlier, just go forward, lunge, and hit them. Now let's say you step into the misura larga and then your opponent does something with their sword. Maybe they gain your blade. Maybe they disengage around you. Well, now you have the opportunity to get into the misura strata because your opponent's body hasn't moved and you're already in the long distance. Now let's get into the short distance. First, you're going to form your new counter posture. Now, if you had a counter posture in fourth and your opponent disengaged, generally you're just going to roll into the second hand position and form your counter posture that way. If they instead push against your blade and sort of find a gain just by moving their tip up and down, then you're going to have to adjust on the same side. But after you do that, you're going to take another step forward, close enough to where if they don't move their body, you can just lean forward and hit. Now from this position, your opponent's going to do a couple of different things if they don't hit you while you're moving into the misura strata. If they back up, you're now in the misura larga, lunge and hit. If they move at all, just lunge and hit, right? Once you're in the misura strata, you are in a wonderful position to hit, but that's kind of a risk-reward payoff. You've moved into the misura larga, which is difficult. Now you're in the misura strata, which is difficult, even harder, and now you should be able to just hit them. So we've already done a drill with a partner on how to form a counter posture and test that if it's correct. And so now we're going to move into solo drills you can do at home to work on counter posture. First, I'm going to show you what I mean by pointing at the thing that scares you. You can see I move the point of my blade to one side of the other, and after I've pointed, I can roll my hand correctly into the correct posture, whether it's into second or into fourth like you saw previously, second, fourth. Now you can practice moving into counter posture. So first you're going to stand on guard with your feet in the correct position, which I'll be demonstrating later, and your offhand above your guard. And you're going to first, move to a position where you point over the thing that scares you, right? So here I'm pointed towards my inside because I'm going to roll into fourth. But you could also do this drill just as easily by forming that counter posture in second. And again, that offhand should be accompanying your guard wherever it moves to give you an extra layer of protection. Once you've formed your counter posture, you then take a step into measure, and from there, the misura larga, you're going to be sure that you lunge by fully extending your sword forward and then lunging. Fabris felt strongly that you should move the sword, then the hand, then the arm, then the body, then the legs, right? It's just the speed of approach. The sword can move faster than your arm, which can move faster than your body, which can move faster than your legs. So you fully extend and then lunge, and then you recover. Okay. You could also form the counter posture on the same side. So here you can see my leg position just a little bit better. My back leg is bent and my toes are pointed more towards my left-hand side, whereas my front foot, my toe is pointed forward. I keep that back leg bent so that I can lunge at any time. I point at the thing that scares me. I roll into the proper position. I take my step forward, and then I lunge. So here I'm moving between the fourth and second hand guards to show you each of those, demonstrating that my offhand is in the correct position, and you lunge forward and recover. Notice that on my lunge forward, my knee is lined up with the tip of my toe. You don't want to extend your knee much further than that or it can cause injury. There are going to be a few plates in this manual, a few illustrations that show this, but I would not recommend it. Notice also that my back foot is completely flat on the ground. This prevents any injury to the ankle of the back foot. My arm is completely straight and extended forward, and my offhand is extended forward, ready to intercept anything that comes forward. Fabris would have also moved this hand behind your head to further extend your reach in fourth hand position, which I will demonstrate a little better. When you recover, you just reverse the bending of your knees, so as your front leg straightens up, your back leg bends again, and you finish that step back. Here we have the second hand position gain, lunge, and step. Notice that that off hand goes underneath the arm in order to provide a wall. Because the sword is high, the wall is created with the other hand low to prevent the sword from hitting if it manages to come off of your blade, perhaps if you're not holding those quillions completely flat. Okay, so here I'm going to demonstrate the correct posture for an extended attack in fourth. After I point at the thing that scares me, roll into fourth, and step into the Missouri Larga, I'm going to fully extend my blade and then my hand. You can see here, and this is why taking footage of yourself occasionally is important, I have started to move my foot before I fully extended my hand, and that is a bad thing. Make sure that you fully extend your blade before you lunge forward, because I'm going to end up fully stepping forward, moving my body towards my opponent, and then I'm going to reach the sword to hit them. Not only does this make me more inaccurate, but it gives my opponent that much more time to react. The seconds that I should have been moving my sword forward at the beginning when I was safe, I will now be doing when I'm unsafe. But you can see that as I completely lunge into fourth, my backhand kind of moves behind my head. I once heard this described from one of Leoni's students as you're on a cell phone and it's kind of near your face as you're on guard, and then you're like, hey, want to hear a guy die? And you hit them in fourth and you fully extend that receiver outwards, and then you move it back to tell them how cool it was as you move back into your guard. So now that we have drilled the Missouri Larga, it's now time to drill the Missouri strata. Again, you're going to form your counter posture in either fourth or second. And as you step forward into the Missouri Larga, pretend that your opponent moves their sword to the other side of your sword, right? They see your counter posture coming forward, they see you moving forward, and they move your sword to the other side so that you no longer have a good counter posture. So what would Fabris have you do? Well, the sword and arm move faster than the body, so you're going to adjust your counter posture to the other side. So here you see I'm going to start in a fourth hand position. I'm going to step forward, and then my opponent, as they disengage, I'm going to move into second. I then need to move into the Missouri strata, so I'm going to step forward, and now that I'm so close to my opponent, I just need to reach out with my sword, do a full extension, and you can see that again I have that straight line from my blade all the way down my arm, all the way to my shoulder. For those that enjoy swimming, oftentimes Fabris guards are like how your arm should be in freestyle, completely in front of you. My offhand is also in a correct position to intercept if they were to disengage around this sword, and then from here after I hit, I'm going to go ahead and recover. I'm demonstrating that I can lean a little bit further with my legs, and then I recover. So to review that again, I'm going to first point at the thing that scares me, and then form my counter posture in fourth hand position. I'm going to step into the Missouri Larga, or lunging distance, but my opponent has disengaged their blade. They haven't moved their body, they've just moved their blade to the other side. So I'm going to move into the opposite of my guard, the second hand guard that will intercept their guard on the other side here, and then I'm going to step into the Missouri strata and then lunge and hit, making sure that my arm is completely straight and that my hand is in an appropriate position, and then I'm going to recover and step back. This is the same drill in the opposite. I have in second hand position, form the counter posture, step into the Missouri Larga, my opponent disengages, I move into the fourth hand position, step, and lean forward to extend. This is great, but if I really want to extend my distance, I'm going to roll that hand back, which is going to rotate my sword shoulder forward a bit more and allow me to gain a little bit more distance as I recover and move back. Now, if you take a tennis ball and you attach a hook to the end and then just take a string and then a command hook anywhere on the ceiling where your significant other doesn't notice, you can begin to do Pell drills. So this same thing, I'm going to form my counter posture in either fourth or second, step into the Missouri Larga, and then extend and hit, right? This allows you to work on your point control. Now here, you're working to just move the tennis ball. You don't want the tennis ball to go careening, because if this was a person and you provide enough energy to move this tennis ball a great amount, you've hit your opponent too hard. So as you do this Pell work, make sure that you're not really moving the tennis ball. There, my tip was way too far back, so I need to work on my distance and try again, right? So I'm going to move into my counter posture, step into the Missouri Larga, lunge, and hit. Again, in my opinion, too hard. You're going to want to make sure that you hit that ball a lot softer, barely moving it, because this is a touch-to-kill game in the SCA. Again, counter posture to hit, lunge, and recover. That one's much better. Didn't move it with anywhere near as much force. Again, counter posture, lunge, and hit, and then recover, making sure that you're keeping that blade extended the whole time. Now you can form that Missouri Larga distance again by moving into second, stepping forward, and lunging to hit, making sure that your hand is underneath as well. Again, in second, step, and hit. Notice that I'm lunging immediately after my back foot hits the ground. In a fight, this is what you would want to do, though the situation is very rare where you can just use the Missouri Larga to hit your opponent. If you do hope for this technique to work, and your opponent does allow it to happen, you need to lunge immediately after your back foot hits the ground after that first step. Now from here, we're going to move into the two-tempo, and then the extension to hit. Again, you're going to step with your guard in fourth as they disengage into second, and then you just moving the sword first, lean forward to hit, and then you recover, keeping that sword extended as you recover. You go the opposite direction, form that counter posture in second. After you step and they disengage, roll to fourth, and extend and hit, and step back into guard. Again, into second, into fourth, hit, back into guard. And this is how you can drill this at home using a Pell, although with a partner you might find some more success as you get to play with blade mechanics and making sure your gain is correct. This is mainly just to make sure that you're practicing your distances. Where can I hit from the long distance? Where can I hit from the short distance? And practicing that. So now that we've looked at what you can do solo for counter posture drills within the large and small distance, the Missouri Larga and the Missouri Strata, let's look at some partner drills if you are fortunate enough to be able to meet with a partner right now. Similar to the solo drills, you're going to form your counter posture, so you can see that Ryan is here on guard and I am moving forward to gain his blade. I'm going to form my counter posture, and then I'm going to step forward. You can see that my gain is increasing as I step forward and I slide down his blade, and also that I have two sections above his one section of sword here. Once my back foot hits the ground, I'm going to go ahead and lunge, moving my hand into the appropriate position and making sure again that I glide up his blade. Ryan makes sure that he moves his hand outwards past the body. The more that you move that blade out, the more control you're going to have over the blade as you come forward. I'm going to gain it and step back. Here, doing the same thing in the opposite direction, a lunge and then a hit. And then here, I'm going to really angulate my sword to make sure that I really have a gain. You can see how much of a difference that slight push of the blade, aligning my fourth hand position with my offhand hip, has caused in that fourth hand position. I even had to break the shot a little bit here because it was such a strong coming forward. I'm going to do the same thing in second. Pointed thing that scares me, for my counter posture, move forward, lunge and hit. Again, and making sure that that guard is lined up with this hip to make sure that I've got as much control as possible. Again, I'm going to point at the thing that scares me, form my counter posture, step into the Missouri Larga, and then hit, making sure that I really bring that hilt out. If I were to drop it completely right now, neither the quillion or the hilt would strike my outside hip. So that's about how far outside of your body you should move your arm out when you strike in second. You can see how much stronger that gain was, and then I recover. Now that I've practiced the Missouri Larga, I'm going to move on to the Missouri Strata. I'm going to point at the thing that scares me, roll into fourth, step forward, and you can see that Ryan just moved his sword. He didn't move his body back, but if I were to go ahead and try to lunge and hit him at this point, his blade point is completely free to strike me as well, which isn't good within the Fabris system. So I'm going to transfer into a second hand position and then take a step forward or lean forward to hit. There I stepped, and you could see how unnecessary that was. I was so close that I actually ended up taking a larger action than I needed to in the course of this. I'm going to move forward again, gain forward, he disengages, I move to the other side, and then this time I just step and lean forward. You can see how much more protected I am. His tip is nowhere near my head anymore. Even if he disengages, he has a much narrower body target. So that extension and leaning the body forward is as much about safety as it is about speed of hitting your opponent. And this lean forward is how you end up with a lot of the stranger Fabris positions that we're going to see as we cover this book. Now here, same drill, step, and a lean forward to hit. Now here we need to do the other side. So I point, I move into second. He disengages around to my inside. So here he can hit this entire chest area. And you can see how dangerous this is. This is why you keep your offhand aligned with your sword so that you have some chance of blocking the blade as it comes in. I can't move forward anymore, or I'm just going to walk straight into his point. So I transfer into a fourth hand position, step, and then lean forward, protecting my head with my hand as I hit. I'm going to do that again. Second hand position, forward, fourth, step, lean forward, and hit in the narrow distance. So those are some drills you can use to work on the Misura Larga and Misura Strata. I'm going to speak a little bit about contratempo because Fabris talks about how dangerous moving into the Misura Larga and Misura Strata can be. He feels that the best time to strike your opponent is when they are moving forward towards you because the feet are going to be the slowest part of your body. And he talks about how whenever someone moves towards you into this Misura Larga, that's your greatest opportunity to hit. And when they move into the Misura Strata, it's also a great opportunity to hit. He talks about how you need to feint towards your guard to kind of move their hand position away and cause them to have to move it back on line to protect themselves. And these are very important concepts that we're going to go into and drill later. He gives a lot of different examples, but he definitely goes into it a lot better further on in the book. So just know that when you're moving into the Misura Larga and the Misura Strata, this isn't a technique that you should really try to apply like in a tournament as is. Make sure that you understand that these are two fairly unsafe actions, and it's the goal of fencing to be able to move into the Misura Larga, the Misura Strata. You do a lot in order to move into these two measures, and you're very rarely going to be able to just move into one. Most commonly, when you move into the Misura Larga, your opponent is just going to step backwards, usually disengaging their blade, in which case you're going to re-counter posture and step again, right, as a basic example. So don't feel like you can just move into the Misura Larga. There's lots of opportunities for your opponent to hit you as you take that large step. But Fabris's answers to this are said a little bit later on in his book. So in the interest of moving through the manual, we are going to address that later. Now the final chapter in the book is on flinging the sword and the principle of two tempi on whether it is better to perform controlled thrust and observe the correct tempo. Flinging your sword is when you thrust your sword forward dramatically, usually in a guard that starts with the hilt at or behind your sword hip. This would be similar to Ryan's guards. As he moves into posture here, his sword is down and more towards his hip, right? And you move your sword forward as quickly as possible so that the weight of your blade is added to your hand and it pulls your body forward and it causes you to gain momentum as you fling the sword forward. And Fabris just says, don't do this ever, and gives many examples why. But let's just talk about it from an SCA context, right? It's unsafe. If you are just flinging your sword at your opponent, you really don't have any control over it, and you're going to probably end up misjudging your distance and harming the person you're fencing against. For that reason alone, you should never do it. But if that's not a good enough reason, Fabris goes into great detail as to how long this action takes. It's over at your hips. You have to completely extend your sword. That's a tempo. Then you're going to be lunging. That's a tempo. So you've taken something that should have been a gradual advance and tried to crunch it into an action that still takes just as long as if you had done it safer. After you've flung your sword forward and you've missed, the only way to hit your opponent is to fully retract your sword and extend it again, and this causes a jabbing motion. You see this a lot in STA fencing as well. People extend their sword and then retract it back to their side over by their sword hip and then extend it again. And each time they perform the jab, that is a 2-tempo action, sometimes more because there's a tempo where they regain their balance before they fully extend that sword again. So Fabris talks about how you can easily counter this as they fling their sword, just you know they're going to do it, step slightly off of their line of attack, extend your blade, they'll run into it. As they withdraw their sword to attack, you can move your body completely out of the path of their extension, or you could just lunge and hit them. Every time they move their sword forward or backward, you have the opportunity to make their life miserable. He then talks about how this same principle of the technique taking too long can be used to describe why beat attacks are oftentimes terrible, because you have to take your sword completely offline, away from your opponent's blade, that's a tempo, then bring it back online with a cutting motion in an attempt to knock your opponent's sword offline, that's a tempo, and then you have to still lunge and extend to hit, that's a tempo. So beat often is a 3-tempo action. He talks about how throughout the fight you should try to keep control of your blade at all times, occupying your opponent's weak, because if you are not doing that, you're going to end up spending an extra tempo to bring your sword in a position where you can actually attack and control their blade, which is why you should do that out of distance before tempos really start to matter when you're fighting for that Missouri Larga. And then he also stresses through every example in this chapter that an attack in contra tempo is best. You should always try to hit your opponent while they are moving towards or attacking you. Okay, and there are a lot of different drills that you can do to practice contra-tempo, but I would prefer to work that into drilling the postures that Fabris has, because you can always hit in contra-tempo, and a lot of his postures put yourself in a position where you can counter an opponent's action. But that's going to be it for sections 1 through 6. I hope you've enjoyed this explanation of the first of Fabris' chapters. We are only on page 8, the beginning of page 10 of the manual, so there's quite a distance to go. I plan on releasing these videos bi-weekly, and if you have any feedback, please comment on the video, email me directly, anything that allows me to fix any mistakes I've made or continue to grow as I perform or as I give this series. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you bring this into practice. I hope you enjoy these drills, and I'll see you next time.